Farther along, we'll know all about it. Farther along, we'll understand why. Cheer up, my brother, live in the sunshine. We'll understand it all by and by.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for coming back to the podcast. Today's special guest is Bobby Ross, the editor-in-chief of the Christian Chronicle. Bobby, good to have you on.
Oh, it's good to be here. I appreciate you having me.
If you will, get us set up with how you got involved with the Christian Chronicle.
I have been at the Chronicle for about 18 years. Now I'm trying to do the math. I came here in 2005 from the Associated Press in Dallas and had worked for AP for about 3 years, had done 15 years at the Oklahoman, which is the daily paper here in Oklahoma City before that. So got a call from Lynn McMillan, who was the president and CEO at that time, and offered me, asked me if I wanted to work for the Chronicle, and said I could take a pay cut and come work for the Lord. And so I did that. It's been a great experience.
Well, very good. Well, going from the AP, probably the world's largest and oldest credentialed press association, to a religious publication had to be quite a change.
I guess in some ways it was. And then in some ways, I think you discover that, telling stories and doing journalism is, whether you're at the AP or the Christian Chronicle or, a little paper anywhere. I mean, you're finding story ideas. You're talking to people. You're trying to make it interesting and do something that people will read. So, I mean, it's different, but it's also, I guess, a lot of the skills and experience I had have translated real well to what I've done at the Chronicle for all these years.
Okay. And how long have you been involved with the Church of Christ? Was it something you grew up in, or did you join it later in life?
I guess I was born on a Sunday night. My dad was in the Air Force then in Laredo, Texas. So Mom was pregnant and she wasn't feeling real great that Sunday night. Dad went to the Church of Christ there close to the Air Force base, and Mom called him and said, you better get home and take me to the hospital. So I was born on a Sunday night. Dad came home from church and took Mom. And then I don't think it was the next Sunday that I was in church. It might have been, but it was really close to then that I was in Church of Christ and have been all my life.
Okay. And how would you describe the Church of Christ you grew up in? Was it more conservative, more moderate, or was it a little bit more liberal?
It was probably more conservative, and probably, I was born late 60s, grew up in the 70s. So I think probably when I was growing up, most churches of Christ would be considered pretty traditional, conservative. Some of the reporting I've done, I think, indicates that churches of Christ were a lot more like McDonald's maybe back then, where you kind of knew exactly what you were going to get and what was on the menu when you walked in a building that said Church of Christ out front. And so, I grew up going to gospel meetings. My dad got out of the Air Force and became a preacher, and we would go do campaigns and, try to tell people about Jesus and baptize people on campaigns and singing late into the night and all that. That's kind of my experience growing up.
Right. And we're going to get into that here in just a minute. Some of your experiences with seeing different changes. I know down here in Houston, Texas, where I'm at, I'm actually south of Houston. I know I've grown up in the Church of Christ, and I went from DeRidder, Louisiana, the Bilbo and Roberts Church of Christ, all the way to Houston now, Waters Road and League City and all those. And I've seen changes along the way. And sometimes you have to go back out and look at the sign out there and make sure you're in a Church of Christ. So
that's true.
For people who are not familiar with, I guess, more traditional Church of Christ that may be watching this podcast, because I do appeal to a larger faith audience, how would you summarize the Church of Christ in maybe in a short paragraph? Just sort of the GED version of it?
I think the Churches of Christ remain very committed to what we would call New Testament Christianity, remain very committed to trying to do what the Bible says and follow biblical examples as close as possible, really committed to the scriptures. And I think that's probably, well, not probably, that is true across the spectrum that you just talked about, from conservative to progressive, or however you would want to describe it. I think in all of those realms, the people would be committed to the scriptures. It just comes down to different people interpreting different scriptures in different ways. And in some cases, some seeing the Bible, if it's silent on a subject, we can do what we want, and others saying it is, we're only going to do exactly what it says for us to do here, and we're not going to make any inferences. I think that's it. I mean, it's autonomous congregations. So you go across the country, or in Houston, go across 100 different churches of Christ, and you have 100 different perspectives, it might seem like in some ways. But then, I think an outsider going into those 100 churches of Christ, maybe 90, 95 of them, it would not seem as different to them as it would to those of us on the inside who kind of are looking at some of those specific things and maybe having opinions on this is how it should be done, or that's how it should be done. I would think, a lot of the things like singing every Sunday, partaking of the Lord's Supper every Sunday, having a sermon, just kind of the basic approach would to an outsider, we would see much more alike than we would be different, even across the spectrum that you're talking about.
Right. In the 18 years that you've been covering stories and different issues in the Church of Christ, what have you seen change the most?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think we probably have the instrumental music issue. Churches of Christ traditionally, historically, have been a cappella. I think there have been more congregations that have either added instrumental worship or said, we're not going to do instrumental worship, but we don't think there's a problem with that. That's just not how we're going to do it. I think women's roles, we've got more women in churches. Some churches have added women as deacons, some even as elders, some have women teaching classes, or some even preaching. So I think the women's roles issue has become an issue. And in general, a lot of the societal issues, like the questions over same-sex marriage and LGBTQ issues, have you see debates on that in a lot of Christian religious groups, and that's true in churches of Christ as well. Although I would think the overwhelming majority of churches are still, see traditional marriage and marriage between a man and a woman as the way that the Bible prescribes it. But that, even that question is being debated in a lot of places, and even in places where it's maybe not a debate, people feel like they know what they believe. Even those churches are having elders are having discussions about, the young people believe this, or we've got a young person who's having questions about gender identity. How do we, what's the best, most loving Christian way to approach that? So I think those kind of issues are there. And then one more thing I'll mention is just obviously the whole realm of denominations in America. Denominations are declining, and we in Churches of Christ see ourselves as non-denominational. Those on the outside would probably say, well, that's a non-denominational denomination, because just, as I just described, we've got a lot of similarities, and we do kind of, I've got the book here on my desk that has like the 13,000 Churches of Christ. So we're non-denominational, but we also have some kind of organizational structure, at least, to kind of put us together. And as people in the U.S. are moving away from denominations, the Southern Baptists are shrinking, the United Methodists are shrinking, Churches of Christ in terms of numbers and congregations as well, we're shrinking. So we're having to deal with some of those issues of how do we grow? What's the best approach to reach a less and less Christian society, or a society at least where Christianity was the predominant viewpoint, and what is the word I'm looking for? Mindset. And it's not that to the extent that it used to be.
Hmm. I was recently interviewing a priest I'd gotten to know quite well over the last couple of years. And in my interview, I'd asked him some of the topics that come up in some of the confessions that they do. Obviously, he's not going to get into specifics, but I was looking for themes and see if we can draw a corollary between what we may be hearing in our churches and what they're hearing in theirs. And he said in that sort of preteen to teen group, he echoed what you said. He said that a lot of times they come in and they're struggling with identity. They're struggling with what they're hearing in school, things that challenge their faith. Seems pretty universal. Now, I don't know how far your coverage for the Chronicle goes out. Is it nationwide, or do you focus primarily in the southern part of America, or describe that for me?
We're an international paper, so we have 135. Well, I think it's 132,000 now subscribers. That's all 50 states. And then we cover internationally. Eric Trigestad I think he's been to like 75 countries reporting for the Chronicle. I've been to all 50 states. So we do, try to reach a really broad audience. And, obviously Churches of Christ are concentrated in the South and Southwest and Bible Belt types of states. So we have more congregations, more people, more readers in those areas, but we do reach, our publication and our coverage as well reaches out far beyond that.
It is interesting. I was talking to a friend of mine that goes to my home church down here, Waters Road Church of Christ, and whenever we have biblical discussions at his house, he refers to Kaufman's commentaries quite a bit. Are you familiar with the Burton Kaufman commentaries?
I mean, I'm a journalist, not a theologian or biblical scholar, so haven't really spent a lot of time with those, with the commentaries, but definitely familiar with his name. And I think he died several years ago.
Yes.
Maybe. Yeah. I remember the obit I don't think I was the one who wrote it, but I remember reading that when we published it.
Mm-hmm. And I understand it that I don't know if he was here, he could correct me, but regardless, the point will remain that I think he'd started off in New York, or somehow maybe ended up in New York helping some of those churches up there. And I was just curious because you had talked about Church of Christ being focused more in Bible Belt in the South, which would be what I would be familiar with. But apparently there was some movement up to the East Coast. So do you know about any there?
I have a vague recollection that maybe he was a song leader at the Manhattan Church of Christ in the 1960s. And, that church is still there, still active. I've been there. This is probably 15 years ago. Been there. They have, it was a really multicultural church, reflecting the ethnic diversity of New York. And so they had people from all over. And when Lester Holt, I don't know if he's still a member there, but Lester Holt from NBC was a member there, and I interviewed him when he was at the Today Show. So I do remember hearing a little bit about that connection.
Okay. And I know you've interviewed Lester. You and I both have interviewed Victor Glover and other folks that are with. I think you've interviewed the new coach for the Houston Texans, who is a member of the Church of Christ. I can't remember his name, but
D'Amico Ryans.
D'Amico Ryans.
We've written about him being the coach, and he's an active member at Fifth Ward, but I'm still trying to get connected to talk to him. So I'm hoping to make that happen.
Yeah. If it's anything like getting the astronaut interviews, it's going to take a while. You know how that is. You get put on the list and you get an email saying, okay, they're available. Are you ready tomorrow? You get it when you can get it. Yeah. What have been, Bobby, what have been some of your most memorable stories, in the sense that there were stories that really stuck out to you as something that reminds you of why you became a journalist in the first place?
Yeah, I always feel stumped at that question, just because, I've been blessed to be a lot of places, and my mind is like, this is what we're doing now, or this is what we just did. So, I just love, not to avoid the question, but I just love, being able to go places and see Christians who are just like living out their faith in a real way. So I'll mention a couple that I've just done in the last few weeks here, but a couple weeks ago I was in Houston at the memorial Church of Christ. They've got a member there who is she's a Russian immigrant. She's 35 now, or give or take. And she immigrated from Russia as a teenager. So she's a nurse practitioner there in Houston now. So David Duncan, the minister, had got a call from the Hidden Valley Church of Christ there in Houston, and they had a Russian refugee who had come to the U.S. He had spoken out against the war in Ukraine, and I guess had fled the country because he was getting in trouble for protesting the war. And so he was baptized at Hidden Valley, and then Hidden Valley was looking for someone to study the Bible more in depth with him. So this woman, Julia, at the Memorial Church, she said, sure, I'll study the Bible with him. So she studies the Bible with him. He mentions while they're meeting, there's a bunch of Ukrainians here at this apartment complex where I'm at, and they need furniture, they need some help. They're refugees, and she says, well, I can help, and I bet my church can help. So long story short, the Memorial Church has like a big group, 40 or 50 Ukrainians that they're helping with food. And the Houston Impact Church of Christ is helping with food, but Memorial members are helping with food and furniture and Bible study. And now they've got a Sunday morning class where Julia and her husband, who's a deacon there, he teaches, and she translates it into Russian. And the Ukrainians, most of them understand Russian. So it's just a story about this woman who, she's Russian. These Ukrainians need help. She says, sure, I'll help. And suddenly there's this big ministry and this big group of Christians who are studying the Bible there. So, stories like that, I enjoy doing. And, then the most recent one published this week was my wife has autoimmune diseases. So she deals with chronic pain. So when this minister, David Heflin, contacted me and said, hey, I've got this ministry called Broken and Mended. We're trying to help people with chronic pain. There's a lot of Christians who don't understand what people are going through. We've got this support group. So I went and interviewed some people and did a story about that. And, both of those are stories that if you didn't read about it in the Christian Chronicle, you probably wouldn't know about it, because it's not things that are making national news, but it's things that are important to, people in churches of Christ feel a connection to it. And they also, I think, hopefully see that one individual person or one individual church can make a really big difference in ordinary lives. So, it's stories like that I think I'm most proud of and feel most blessed to be able to pursue.
Talking about just the newspaper industry in general. Now, you and I both are newspapermen, and you've done editing work longer than I have, but I've been writing and doing, of course, multimedia journalism now, as you are doing as well. For people who don't know anything about what we do, or particularly what you do with the Christian Chronicle, the editing part, talk through a quote unquote normal day for you, if there's such a thing.
Yeah, a normal day. And there's really not. And it's, we have a small staff here. So it's some days I am connecting with correspondents and writers and talking about stories for them to do, or editing stories with them and helping get stories online. And some days I'm doing my own reporting and writing. And some days I'm trying to figure out, how do I get this story I want to write done, and also edit this great story that somebody else has done? So, we're kind of, you mentioned multimedia, and, it used to be the Chronicle print publication is, it's a 40-page tabloid that mails out once a month. But it used to be that we would put stuff in the paper, and then when the web era came, then, after the paper goes to press, we kind of take it from InDesign and copy and paste stuff and put it on the web. Now we're more digital first. So we're trying to report news and even features, we get them online, and then we'll get to, we go to press a week from Friday. I guess we're about 10 days from going to press with our next issue. So about that Monday before the Friday press day, we'll say, hey, we got to put out a paper. What do we got to publish? And, a lot of what we publish in print will already have been published online. but it's amazing. Even we haven't figured out yet the secret to getting people to read it as much online as, our readers still probably be a big percentage of them are seeing stories for the first time when they get it in the mail, which I guess is good too, because we have loyal readers who are reading print, and then we hopefully are reaching some of those readers online, but also readers who don't read print. They're getting it. So, I mean, it's a typical day. That week I shift from online to let's do some page design and get the paper ready to go to press. And then we can get back to focusing online and social media. We have the print product now. We have a weekly podcast that Brad Irwin hosts for us, and about kind of goes behind the scenes of some of the Chronicle stories. We've got TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, all that Calvin Cockrell, our social media and digital editor, he handles that. So it's we got a lot of moving parts at this point that we didn't used to have. Even when I got here in '05, we were mainly focused on print, and now it's print, digital, social media, podcast, audio. I mean, we've got a YouTube channel as well, but we haven't really focused on video as much as we probably should. We do have the TikTok account that Calvin does, and we had, I guess, a post of his went viral. There was a Church of Christ member played by Dennis Quaid in a movie about this plane that was miraculously landed, and I can't remember the name of the movie. It was an Amazon movie just a few months ago, but somehow the post that Calvin did, one of them got like 5 million views, and there were a couple of posts related to that also got into the millions. So, most of our TikToks don't go viral, but we have had a few that do, and I'm sitting there thinking in those cases, could some of those people maybe read some of this story that I spent so much time on instead of this quick, 30-second video that we just posted on a whim? But, that's the era that we live in.
No, you're right about that. And when I got into print journalism, or really, I guess I should say journalism in general, back in '08, it was for Houston Community Newspapers, which is part of Hearst, part of the Chronicle family, Houston Chronicle family. And I remember back then it was still very heavily print laden, and we had websites, but it was still focused on print first. And then we went from having staff photographers to, if we're going to hire you as a journalist or as a reporter, you better be able to take your own pictures. So they started diversifying a little bit more. So you had to be able to shoot and write and interview. And then we started playing a little bit with, well, while you're out there, grab a video clip, grab a little bit of video with the internet.
Yeah.
And now we're into podcasting and, audio, video podcasting and TikTok and everything else. So it's kind of a shotgun approach to cover all of our audiences,
Right.
Yeah. Because everyone's reading our messages, our stories through some means. Maybe they stick to traditional print, or it's online, or it's on their phone, or some people want to see us talking and listen to us or just read it. To me, I'm kind of an old fashioned journalist in the sense that when I can read it in print, to me, it's the real thing,
Yeah. No, I was always like, I'm always going to have a newspaper delivered in my driveway. Print is how I've got to have it. And then our local paper, the delivery got so bad that I was paying for a paper, and 2 or 3 days a week they would not deliver it. And so that, I still read it like the print replica on my iPad, but I don't get an actual paper in the driveway anymore, which I never, it's kind of a whole new world, because I never thought I would be one of those people.
Yeah. Now you get the PDF version of the print story, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It looks really good.
Yeah.
So reader and listener feedback over the years, talk about the trends of what readers are looking for, and now I guess listening for when they're listening to more multimedia podcasts over the years.
Yeah, I think we're blessed with really loyal readers and really appreciate, Churches of Christ have somewhat of a history of like doctrinal kind of publications where people do like, it's more editorial in nature than reporting in nature. So they take strong or controversial opinions on some of the doctrinal issues that we're debating. So I think our readers tend to appreciate our focus. We on reporting and we're a newspaper, not a views paper, although we have a few pages that are editorials, but those are clearly marked. But I think in general, readers appreciate that. I think in the last few years, as the nation itself has become more politically polarized, we experienced some of that brushback among our readers who are used to reading a publication or watching a TV channel that just gives them the spin on whatever the news is that they want to hear. So if they're confronted with facts or coverage that doesn't 100% align with what they think is true or they want to be true, then we get some pushback, and that's but I still think that's a minority of people, but we've seen more of that just, and more, I guess, Christians who I find myself questioning whether they're watching cable TV or reading their Bible more with some of the stuff that they hit us with. But,
Yeah.
And once again, I've lost the question, but
No, that's
there. But
just talking about listener feedback over the years and what they're wanting from you, and what they're saying about the publication. Yeah.
Okay.
So, back in the late 90s, certainly early 2000s, we were battling with the transition from print to online, like we mentioned a little bit ago. Now we find ourselves in 2023 looking to face another big challenge, which may really affect us more than going to the internet, and that's AI. How do you see AI affecting coverage in the Christian Chronicle? Will it change anything at all, or would it be business as usual?
That's a great question. I probably don't understand it real well at this point. And all these other things we've mentioned that have got my attention, I don't know. The best term for it may be my head's still buried in the sand about AI, because I really haven't spent a lot of time with it to understand how it's going to affect us. So I see some of the headlines and I've read some of the stories that are kind of scary about just, how it's going to affect the consumption and the delivery of information in general, and just the ability to, misinformation has become a big concern in recent years. And it seems like that AI is only going to make that challenge greater. But if I'm totally honest, I have not had the time or made the time to really investigate that real closely and understand what it means for us.
Mm-hmm. I had read a story over the weekend where they say it was the first AI sermon was delivered in Germany at a church. Did you read that on the internet?
I did. That was an Associated Press story.
Yes.
It was really interesting story. I did read that.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on that? And do you see see people doing that more and more, and what effect that might have on the interaction between a real preacher and something that's made up that could, as you said earlier, could be lying or misrepresenting the gospel?
I have a little bit of a hard time thinking that many of our, churches of Christ are going to turn their sermons over to AI. So, I don't know that I've got a big concern about it at this point. And I have seen preachers talk about, some of the potential benefits and strengths of using AI to help research or to help frame thoughts. But as far as just turning the pulpit over to AI, I will be surprised. If of churches doing that, that would be, we would report on that. That could be an interesting story. But I guess I think I'll be a little surprised if it happens in our fellowship.
Right.
Famous last words.
Yeah, you never know these days.
Yeah.
Things have changed quite a bit over the years, but I think that would be interesting. I wouldn't be too much in favor of seeing an AI quote unquote preacher, but it's not stopping people from trying. Current projects, current stories you're working on. Is there anything you can give us a little teaser on? What's the Christian Chronicle working on now?
We started a series in January on the shortage of ministers in churches of Christ. And so we've had several stories on that topic, and we've got several more kind of looking into that issue and kind of why is there a shortage? Is there anything that can be done about that. One that I'm still wanting to do is kind of look at churches. I hear that search committees for churches, on the one hand, they say we can't find any qualified applicants who meet what we need. And on the other side, you hear from people that are applying for jobs saying, I keep hearing from churches that they can't fill their pulpit, and yet I keep applying and keep either not getting a call or not getting hired. So it seems like there's a little bit of a disconnect between what churches are looking for and what ministers who are applying or offering. So I think that's probably something we're going to report on.
Mm-hmm. To your knowledge, Bobby, are there any underlying issues that could cause problems, quote unquote, with Church of Christ in the future? And my reference to that is I've got a fellow journalist friend of mine and a pastor in the Methodist Church, Mark Fleming. We meet quite a bit and talk about journalism and church issues between his and ours and everything else. And of course, as you know, that the United Methodist Church and the Methodist Church had recently had a split. You see any problems with Church of Christ coming down the path, or do you think everything's going pretty smooth other than little various changes here and there?
Things that might split us, or
not necessarily a split, but just maybe waves of change, just like they had went through.
Yeah, I think we're in a period where, the progressive conservative stuff. I think, in some cases, there's even been a de facto split between this group of churches associate with each other and this group of churches doesn't, or this group of churches, you've got your, like you have Winterfest, which is a big youth event for kind of the more middle to progressive churches. And then you've got Challenge Youth Conference kind of held in some of the same geographic areas in Texas and Tennessee that's more middle to right. And so you've got, and I think, the women's issues that we mentioned earlier, the music issues, politics are causing some divisions between people who think, Christian nationalism is okay and other, and that's a real hard thing to define as well. But,
right.
Kind of the idea that, God is country in our churches, or the, keeping national politics and national patriotism out of the church. There are things like that could cause some issues and are causing some issues. I think we saw during COVID and the question of, are we going to meet online? Are we going to vaccinate or not vaccinate? There's just I think there's any number of issues that could cause issues and may be causing issues. And I'm not expressing it real well. It's really hard to generalize, as you know, because it's 12,000, in the U.S., it's 12,000 autonomous churches, and there's nobody, 12,000 autonomous churches, and individually, nobody's there. We've got the book I showed you earlier, but as far as saying you're in or you're out or you're in the Lamb's Book of Life, I mean, some people want to do that, but in general, churches of Christ they're autonomous. So everybody's kind of, for good and bad, coming to their own conclusion and decisions on what they believe the Bible is teaching and where God is leading them.
Bobby, in the stories and research and I see a lot of stuff on Facebook. I know you're at different churches a lot, and so I know you're talking to people and getting a feel for things. Do you see any trends of people coming into the Church of Christ over the years, maybe contrasting that from when you started to now, where are you seeing more people coming from other faiths or maybe no faith at all?
Well, I don't know that I feel qualified to answer that. I mean, I think in general, churches in general, I think it's multi-generational. The churches, the people in the church, are people who have a family connection or have grown up in the church. I mean, there are some notable exceptions where people are reaching people who've converted out, coming from other Christian backgrounds or just or being converted to Christianity for the first time. There are cases, we have, I think in some places, immigrants are coming to churches, and some of them from Church of Christ background, some of them finding Churches of Christ for the first time. I know there's some church planting efforts among various congregations and churches of Christ that are trying new approaches to try to get the message to people and seeing some success with that. But I think in general, I think the overall numbers, the fact that we're shrinking and our congregations are graying would tell you that a lot of younger people are not staying in the church and that we're not bringing a lot of new people in, which is the the denominational, the trend that we talked about earlier in the podcast.
Do you have any personal opinions as far as why you think those numbers are shrinking? And I think that could also tie into another question of why the number of available preachers, as you mentioned earlier, is shrinking as well. Is there a correlation between the two, or are they sort of separate?
No, I think there's a correlation between the two as far as the fact that there are fewer young people in churches of Christ would obviously shrink the pool of, would seem to shrink the pool of potential people to go into ministry. I think there's also just the way a lot of churches have treated ministers have made young people think, I'm not sure that's something I want to do. The pay is not great. The benefits are not great. And then, with the poor pay and poor benefits, and then the people aren't going to treat me great in a lot of cases. I think that is a factor. I think, the societal things we mentioned, just not as much of an emphasis on churches of Christ. I mean, not as much of an emphasis on faith. They're trying to bring people into churches of Christ. And I think, and then we've also talked about I think there's less, quote, brand loyalty among the younger generation. So if you're a younger person who grows up in churches of Christ and grows up believing that in a less sectarian view of churches of Christ, as some people would present churches of Christ as the only church, as opposed to only, we're not, I think the saying back in the Restoration movement was, we're only Christians. We're not the only Christians. That if you're a young person growing up thinking that churches of Christ and other people who are studying their Bibles in different faith groups are, we're all just trying to do the best we can to serve Jesus. If you grow up with that mindset, then you don't feel an obligation to think I have to be a minister or have to stay in a church of Christ. Then there were probably, I'm not sure the best way to say this, but there are probably more exciting churches to go minister in than churches of Christ. I don't mean that in a negative way, but we are, we're a simple group of believers and not maybe the most exciting worship or approach to how we do things. And I really hate how much I'm overgeneralizing, but I'm just trying, thinking out loud about some of the reasons that we might be having fewer young people go into ministry.
I categorize our churches to friends of mine who don't belong as a very matter of fact church. It's very matter of fact. It's simplistic, but it's just the facts, so to speak. We try to stay to that. But I guess in conclusion, Bobby, if people are interested in learning more about the Christian Chronicle or want to buy a subscription, where can they find that information and why should they subscribe?
I would send them to the Christian Chronicle, not the Christian Chronicle. It's christianchronicle.org on the website, and you can read all of our articles on that website. You can even read all of our PDF editions, which are fully interactive, kind of see it the way that it shows up in print, and then push on the headline or click on the headline to read the online version of the story. You can also, there's a place on the website to easily subscribe to the paper and have it delivered in your mail once a month if you prefer the print edition. So that would be the best way to get in touch with it.
Well, very good. Well, Bobby, I'm glad I was able to get you in such short notice to come on the podcast, and I wish you and the Chronicle all the best, and God bless in everything you do.
Oh, you're welcome. And if I had more notice, I would have worn a better shirt. So thanks for letting me be on here in a t-shirt. But it's good to talk to you. I appreciate it.
Good to talk to you too, Bobby. God bless.
You too.